everyone. So welcome to your second lecture. This lecture is going to focus on the topic of Chapter 2 and what is art. So in this chapter, we will focus on explaining relationships between artists and their audience, discussing the relationships between art and beauty, and categorizing art by its appearance, examining art for its meaning, as well as summarizing the purpose of artworks. So when we talk about what is art, essentially we've kind of briefly talked about this in our past couple of lectures, but art is something that has great value in many societies. And around the world, art museums are as much part as civic pride for many cultures and people, as sports stadiums, as shopping districts, public libraries, and other institutions and locations. So the prestige of art is such a thing we often do when we're visiting museums, but maybe we're not exactly sure why. So the question is, we did talk about art and what is art, and it's really not an easy question to answer. So as we look at the Mona Lisa here, we see here this was a work of Western art. Leonardo da Vinci painted this portrait during the early years of the 16th century. The woman, the sitter or person pictured was a woman named Lisa, which is where Mona Lisa got its title from, obviously. And Leonardo portrayed her seated on a balcony that overlooked a landscape of rock and water. Her left forearm is rested on the arm of the chair, and her right hand kind of settles gently over her left wrist. She turns her head to look at us with just a hint of a smile. So this interesting thing about this portrait, which we briefly talked about in some of our previous lectures, is how it looks so miraculously lifelike. But it's also kind of a foreshadowing event and showing how this is a product of our own new modern era. And just, when it was recovered, its fame grew. It was stolen from a museum in 1911. And when it was recovered, the fame grew about it. So it's just very interesting how this work was a little bit foreshadowing of what is art and, how do we analyze art, what do we talk about, how do we understand it. Moving on once again to The Fountain by Marcel Duchamp. We briefly talked about this as well in some of our previous, but we talked about it being a ready-made and that it was not really designated as a work of art. And so that, the big question we talked about last time was, who's to say this is or isn't art? And then there was this example that came into the idea of some very interesting philosophical questions. So, does art have to necessarily be made by an artist? Is art a form of intention? If we've spent our lives perfecting this form of attention, can we bestow it on absolutely anything? How is an art object different from any type of other object? Does art depend on context as being shown as an art place such as a museum or gallery? Can something be art in one place and not another? Is Fountain still considered art today, or was it art only for the time that Duchamp said it was? So, there's so many philosophical questions that we can go into and analyze and rethink, and something we think about today may change in a week, a year, 10 years, etc. about what we think about this. I think the idea of philosophically thinking about this, was this just an idea of what is art or what is not art for this time period, or can it still relate to topics of art that we encounter today, or in just everyday society items? This is a flipped urinal. Is that something that we would consider art today, or is that just kind of a spark 15 seconds of fame moment during this time period? So I definitely think that's an interesting concept to think about. When we go, think about the production, it kind of raises questions about the roles of artists in the production of a work of art. So if we look at the next work, we see Diego Velázquez's painting, Las Menas, the Maids of Honor. And this demonstrates the role of an artist to create a work of art with his own hands. So Velázquez here is representing himself working on a very large canvas. Scholars and critics kind of debated back and forth what he exactly might be painting here, but they essentially said that he was creating this work of art with his own hands. So that made it his own art, that made it his work and his originality. He used this to make a clear statement about the identity of artists, as creative geniuses. So he came up with the idea for the image. He decided the sizing, the colors, the lighting. He figured out how to arrange the composition, the figures within the composition. He used his unique style of drawing and painting to execute the work. So, this style was really admired by many people due to his choices for his own work of art. But it's very interesting because as we look at this next piece, and this is a comparison piece in your text here, there's a contemporary Japanese artist by the name of Yasumasa Morimura. And on the other hand, kind of challenges this nature of this creative role. So this work was in praise of Velasquez, so it's kind of supposed to be a rendition, a little bit more modern and contemporary idea of the Velasquez. If you look at the comparison, you kind of see similar setups, here. So the difference here, though, is both artists did include themselves in a self-portrait. That was a big thing, especially during the time that Velasquez was creating his art. It was very common for artists to include themselves somewhere in the painting in some format, whether it was very small or whether it was very prominent. So this artist, Morimura, also included his self-portrait. However, the photographs that are used throughout is actually the artist dressed up as himself. If you look really closely, especially if you're looking at the text as you're following along with this lecture, and you look at the images, every image, every person represented in this artwork here is actually a self-portrait of the artist himself. So the artist actually dressed up as each of the characters, then photographed himself, and then later assembled the photographs into a single image on this canvas to make it one continuous print. So he kind of recreated it, but he did it in his own way. So the idea, that's considered, like Duchamp's ready-made with the urinal raises questions of the artist's role in the creative process. So if you think about it, the question would be for this work, who owns the idea for a work of art and what is considered originality? Is this considered originality because the artist recreated himself as the characters in the painting? I mean, he physically dressed himself up, photographed himself, and recreated these. So, or is it not considered original because he was using the influences of the Las Manas? Or is it purely influential and he is an original artist? So I think that's something to contemplate as well because, like I mentioned previously in the last video, or if I didn't, I hope I did, so I'll repeat it here. There's a difference in copying works of art, and then there's a difference in being influenced by work of art. Every time period, every section of art has continuously been influenced by works before them, whether they go against those works of art or whether they use them to create new styles and works of art. So either way, they're being influenced, whether it's necessarily, I wouldn't say a positive or a negative, but whether it's more of a, did they influence them to try new things, or did they influence them in a way that they're going to take this idea, but maybe they're going to add a little bit to it. But that does question the idea of originality. If this work was technically already completed and you're essentially just redoing it on your own terms, then whose work is considered the original work? Because technically they're both different. Different artists are putting both their names on it and claiming it as their own original work. But who's to say which artwork came first or which artwork is considered more original than the other? So deep questions there. A lot of, beating around the bush there, kind of, I guess, as you could say. But you want to continue to think about that as you look at works, especially when you start to see some contemporary art, such as this one by Morimura, and you start to move into the idea of, are they being influenced, and does that hinder the creative process, or does the influence kind of propel and accelerate that creative process, and, how do they take that to the next level? As we move into artist and audience, we're going to talk a little bit more about the world of independent artists, art schools, galleries, critics, collectors, and museums, and how familiar they are today. So as we look at the next work, this is the David sculpture by Andrea del Verrocchio. This was done in 1465. It's bronze with gold details. This is a very interesting work of art. It's a statue of the biblical hero David. The work was commissioned by the head of a very wealthy and powerful Florentine family. So Verrocchio learned his skills as an artist of the time by serving as an apprentice in the workshop of a master. At the time, opportunities were only available to males, and their apprenticeship could begin between the ages of 7 and 15. In exchange for their labor, they often received room and board and sometimes a small salary. So this was very interesting because many apprentices would actually, they might make copies of the master's work for sale and kind of sell them kind of on the side or over the counter. So this goes back to that idea of whose work is original. A lot of people say that this David might actually be a portrait of the artist himself in a form, even though the context is taken from the biblical painting here. So as we continue to move on for artist and audience. So as we look at the figure on the left here, Virgin of the Immaculate Conception, this was created in the 18th century. It's made of an ivory material. It's only about 10 inches high. It was carved by an unknown artist in the Philippine Islands and represents the Virgin Mary and illustrates the Catholic doctrine of Mary's conception without the stain of original sin. The artist responsible for the sculpture never met the person who ultimately purchased it, but a lot of these artists worked under the direction of the European missionaries and created sculptures such as this one as export items to be sent across the Pacific Ocean to both Latin America and Europe. A lot of local artists at the time would work on speculation, responding to the demand for export goods. So our final artist actually takes us out of the realm of professional training, career paths, and intended audiences altogether, which is the image here on the right by James Hampton. This artist necessarily had no particular training in art, and the only audience he ever sought during his lifetime was himself. For most of his adult life, he actually worked as a janitor for the federal government in Washington, D.C., but secretly labored this extraordinary work called The Throne of the Third Heaven of the nation's Millennium General Assembly. It was discovered after his death in a garage that he had rented, and the work represented Hampton's vision of the preparation of the second coming as described in the biblical book of Revelation. So there's also this idea here too, we talked about audiences, this one being used as a missionary piece, and then this one was actually made for the artist himself, and he didn't necessarily maybe even wanted to share his artwork with anyone or planned for anyone to see his artwork. But it's also very interesting, did he consider himself an artist, or did he realize who may see his works of art at some point, or was he purely just making this for himself and it ended up coming about into the world? A lot of times I feel like sometimes art like this kind of meaningful art, people are like, well, they didn't have training, they weren't trained at this facility, or they didn't have this background or this experience. But a lot of times meaningful art is kind of an example of outsider art, and to me it actually becomes more meaningful. Not that I'm saying you shouldn't have training. I do think training and experiences and schooling and things like that are important even within the art world. But sometimes people who just do art as a hobby, or kind of just take it at their own leisure, sometimes create these very extraordinary ideas, and then there's that idea of who are they trying to reach? Is it truly for themselves, or is it for people or a certain audience around them? Now, in this time of the internet and social media, you can kind of build your program, you can kind of build your business essentially as an artist, or whatever you may be marketing or targeting. You can kind of build it around an audience, and you can kind of share things and distribute things via the internet or via social media and kind of create your own concept of, art and the audience that you're trying to reach there. All right, so the next part we'll be talking about art and beauty. So beauty itself is deeply linked to our thinking about art, the idea of aesthetics, which is a branch of philosophy that studies art and also studies the beauty of nature. So many think that the entire purpose of art is to be beautiful. If we think about, like we've said before, about a child drawing, sometimes their works may not always create the end result of something beautiful, but we may watch their process throughout as they work somewhat towards a final product, and we may begin to realize that it's their process that's beautiful, even if the product isn't beautiful itself. So, should we think this way, and why should we think this way, and is what we think even true? Does art's entire purpose have to be centered around the idea that it has to be this beautiful, aesthetically pleasing work of art here? So as we look at this image here in particular, we'll notice this is by Edward Weston. It's called Cabbage Leaf. It's a gelatin silver print. This was done in 31. So when you gaze at it, you can tell by, this is all one tone of the image. So as you gaze at the way the light kind of caresses the leaf, we begin to kind of feel our vision detaching from itself. Are we looking? No, the title gives us an idea maybe of this idea of cabbage leaf, but at the same time, if we weren't given a title, or if it was left untitled, what would you think of this as? Would you consider it beautiful? Do you consider it beautiful because you know that it's a cabbage leaf? Or would you just think this kind of wilty, leafy green thing, maybe you don't even think it looks like cabbage or a leaf. Maybe you think it looks like a piece of fabric, or maybe it looks like part of a dress or something like that. Um, it kind of looks, maybe looks like a wave crashing on the shore or a ball gown trailing across a lawn. So letting our imagination kind of play is also this idea that comes into the idea of, art and beauty and aesthetics and reaching certain audiences. And that's very philosophical. Is there always such a pleasure in looking at art? Sometimes we look at art and we're like, oh my gosh, no, that is not aesthetically pleasing. Why is this even considered art? How can I make something that looks so much better than that, and then this person gets to have their artwork displayed and it costs millions or thousands of dollars, etc. So we're going to look at that as we move into the next few images. So Kathy Kollwitz is an artist. This is called Woman with Dead Child in the Third State, done in 1903. This one is very interesting as well. There's, kind of a sadness would be a very appropriate word when looking at this. But a lot of people also talked about how it can be very moving as well, because the idea was that the theme was borrowed of a mother with a dead child from the Pietà, a standard subject in Christian art picturing Mary, the mother of Jesus, holding her son after he was taken down from the cross. So the artist here actually used herself and her son as models to represent the mother's profound grief over her child's death. The woman wraps her body around her son and envelops him one last time. So although the subject matter itself is considered both sad and moving, and most people would consider this a mourning type of phase, as opposed to pleasurable, it's still considered a beautiful print by the use of the mark making and the engraving and the way that she kind of cultivates that. So even if the image and the context and the message itself may be sad, or it may be gory, or it may be something that we would not necessarily consider happy, joyful, or even pleasing, we can still consider the techniques and the textures and the actual image itself, just the image, maybe necessarily just what we're looking at, not necessarily the deeper meaning or the context behind it. And we can still be like, okay, this is a beautiful work of art, even though the sadness may overpower that kind of idea behind of, is it beautiful because it's happy and joyful and upbeat, or is it beautiful because of the aesthetics of it and the way that the artist used line and shape and principles and elements and all these things combined together to create this work of art? And I think that's the big question as well when we surround ourselves with art and beauty and talking about what is art as well. Another example is this of Saturn devouring one of his children by Francisco Goya, done in 1820 to 1822. This artist worked through decades of the turn of the 19th century, lived through very tumultuous times, and witnessed very terrible acts of cruelty, stupidity, warfare, and slaughter. This is one of a series of kind of nightmares that Goya painted on the walls of his own house, actually. So they're very powerful, and they have a very almost kind of urgent message. We recognize them as very extraordinary art, but we also have to admire, the oil and plaster that he used. Obviously, like it says, these were painted on the walls of his home. So when they detach them, we have to think about, we think about the shadows, and we think about the chiaroscuro effect, and we think about the intensity of it. So even though we may not necessarily want this in our house, and we would not necessarily paint this on the walls of our home, we can still appreciate the aesthetics of this work as well. And I think that's what is important when we talk about art as a whole. We will discuss a little bit more in the next few slides as we move into art and appearances.